Hi everyone, welcome back to Harp and Guitar, People and Music. So thanks for swinging by again today for another edition of Blues History here on Harp and Guitar. And before we jump back into our blues time machine and head out of the 1930s, I just wanted to wrap this decade up a little bit by talking about some of what I refer to as the founding fathers of the Delta Blues. Fellows like Charley Patton, Son House, Skip James, Mississippi John Hurt. A lot of these well-known, but in some cases not so well-known bluesmen of the late 20s and early 30s era. Now, as I mentioned in earlier installments here of Blues History, because of the Great Depression in the United States and consequently in Canada as well, there was a lot less recording being done, especially with some of the more obscure artists, and specifically with a lot of these field recordings where they would load up mobile recording units and head out into the Delta or to the Mississippi Hill Country or into Kentucky, Georgia. They were doing a lot less of these sort of field recordings, and basically they were focusing a lot of their resources and money into recording really well-established artists of the sort of classic blues, which were basically more of the polished so-called professional blues artists that were performing in some of the larger cities like New York, St. Louis, Chicago, so on and so forth. And even some of the major metropolitan areas in the South, like Jackson and Clarksdale and so forth. But what I really wanted to cover today with this installment was talk about, like I said, some of these guys that I call the founding fathers. The ones that not only to help to sort of develop the blues into a more cohesive, standardized form of music, but the guys that went on to influence the next generation of bluesmen that came in the 40s and in the 50s. And in some cases, these early blues pioneers from the 30s actually had an influence in the 60s, because a lot of them were rediscovered, if you will, in the 1960s through a lot of the folk music scene that was going on in college campuses throughout the United States in the late 50s and early 60s. So the first gentleman that I want to briefly talk about here is probably somebody that most people have heard of, because he's quite well known, not only now in modern times with most blues aficionados, but he was quite famous in his own right, even in his own time. And that's a gentleman by the name of Charley Patton. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Charley Patton's work. Charley Patton was an amazing bluesman and a very prolific blues player, songwriter, and he did a little bit of everything, in the sense that he started off as a really, really early bluesman that incorporated a lot of what we refer to as the primitive proto-blues or pre-blues, like field hollers, into his repertoire. There are many stories about Charley Patton being a very powerful performer. He was a small man, small in physical stature. He was roughly about 5'6", 5'7", and he didn't weigh more than, most accounts say, around 130, 140 pounds. Just a very small man, but commanded a huge amount of attention. He had an amazing presence when he was performing. Now, he was never really at the level where he would go up north to Carnegie Hall or any of these major professional music venues. But he was very huge in his immediate area and became a massive influence on all kinds of blues artists that would follow in his wake. Most notably, my man right here, the Howlin' Wolf. The Howlin' Wolf has often cited Charley Patton as being one of his greatest influences. In fact, a young Howlin' Wolf learned firsthand a lot of the chords and songs and playing with a slide directly from Charley Patton. A young Howlin' Wolf would venture over to Dockery's plantation, which was sort of Charley Patton's home base when he wasn't really touring around in the South to a lot of the juke joints and that sort of thing. And the Wolf would spend time learning and sort of picking the brain of Charley Patton. Now, Charley Patton is also famous for not only commanding this huge presence, but he had a very powerful, booming voice. He had a very gruff, rough-sounding, hard-driving type of voice, and he often would echo that in his guitar playing as well. He was a very aggressive guitar player, not a lot of very soft strumming and intricate picking the way he played. Charley Patton would play bottleneck style, or he would play without the slide, and he played in a couple of different ways. He would play traditional method, where he would play with a slide or without a slide, and with the guitar sort of held in the standard traditional position. But he very often would play with the guitar on his lap as well, where he would place the guitar, he would sit down and place the guitar on his lap and either play with a slide and strum the strings and pick the strings in this method, or again, without a slide, he would play very much like you see a lot of modern blind blues guitarists today, like, for example, the late great Jeff Healey. And he would strum and pick with his right hand and fret with his left hand like such. And Charley Patton played both ways. The other thing he was very famous for as well was a lot of the showmanship. There's a lot of stories from interviews of bluesmen that had witnessed firsthand the way Charley played, like, for example, the Howlin' Wolf, where Charley was much more than just a musician or a songster. He was a professional entertainer, and he would very often employ a lot of showmanship into his act and his routines. There's many stories that I've read and heard from other blues artists where Charley Patton was one of the first to play the guitar, behind his head, or behind his back, or between his legs, or he would throw the guitar up in the air and it would spin around and he would catch it. This was obviously long before guys like T-Bone Walker in the 40s and 50s would do, or later on guys like Jimi Hendrix and Buddy Guy would do as well, where they play with their teeth and play behind their head, behind their neck, and that sort of thing. And the reason that he did this was, again, because he played in a lot of these smaller localized juke joints, whether in a smaller city in the South through the 30s, like Jackson or Leland, Mississippi, but he would also play in a lot of the country juke joints and a lot of the rural barrel houses. And as a result, he really parlayed a huge reputation for himself as not only being a great singer and guitar player and songwriter, but just being an excellent entertainer, an excellent musician and showman. Now, kind of along these same lines and roughly around the same time period is another famous bluesman that many of us have heard of, Mr. Son House. And Son House, again, was one of these guys who was a terrific bluesman and musician and songster, but also a fantastic showman as well. And many of us are very familiar with Son House and some of his amazing works. And Son House went on to influence much more famous, or soon to be much more well-known bluesmen such as Robert Johnson and, of course, the late great Mr. Muddy Waters. Muddy Waters himself says that Son House taught him many songs. And there are a lot of stories of a young Robert Johnson hanging around with Honey Boy Edwards and Son House and Jelly Jaw Short, a lot of these guys. And that's how Robert Johnson learned the fundamentals of what would become his style of blues playing, was from guys like Son House. Now, Son House, he's one of the guys that I was referring to that did a lot of recording in the 30s and 40s, and then sort of seemed to seemingly disappear from the music scene until he was, quote, rediscovered in the 60s by a bunch of blues aficionados and blues record collectors and blues researchers and writers. He was found working in upstate New York, in Rochester, New York, as a porter for a railroad. and he was basically coaxed out of his musical retirement and encouraged to come back and perform for these college kids that were really into folk music. Now, as mentioned before in plenty of videos here on this channel, there's a direct correlation between not only blues, but early proto and pre-blues and folk music. I mean, basically, blues and western swing were just a form of folk music. People of all walks of life enjoyed and listened to and played this form of music. So it stands to reason that in the late 50s and early 60s, when these college kids were exploring this new form of folk music, they were looking back to where it all came from, and they were finding out about guys like Son House and Skip James and Mississippi John Hurt. And Son House was one of these guys that was rediscovered. So he sort of had a second, two careers. He had sort of a second coming or a rebirth. Again, he recorded a lot in the 30s and 40s, disappeared for a bit, and then came back in the 60s to do a lot of live performances. And then he also did some recordings and performed where he's actually on videotape performing. And there's a lot of that you can find here on YouTube. Just type in Son House Live and you'll see a lot of black and white footage of Son House either performing on his own or with other people. And now, staying in this sort of time period and with these guys that were the founding fathers of the blues, but were also rediscovered through the 60s in the folk music scene, are guys like Skip James. Now, Skip James, again, a very prolific bluesman, exceptionally talented guitar player, and a hauntingly beautiful voice, probably a 3 or 4 octave range where he could sing in a very high falsetto, but also maintain some of these lower bass notes as well with his voice. And a fantastic, outstanding guitar player. One of the best guitar pickers of that time period, in my opinion, is Jeremiah Skip James. And as you can see from this record album of his recordings from 1930, he's been around for a long time. He had already been recorded quite extensively and was quite well known by the mid to late 1930s. And again, he kind of disappeared for a little bit and then resurfaced in the 1960s during that folk music revival. So I would highly recommend, if you can get your hands on anything by Skip James, you'll understand what I mean by the hauntingly beautiful voice and the amazing picking style of his guitar playing. Absolutely fantastic and a very gifted artist. Now, I also mentioned a name you may have just heard a few moments ago, a name that's a little bit more obscure, and that was the name of J.D. Short, later known as Jelly Jaw Short. And again, one of these guys that was did quite an extensive amount of recording through the 30s and even into the 40s, and then sort of seemed to disappear, and then it came back during the folk music revival. And J.D. Short, or Jelly Jaw Short, was a harmonica player and a vocalist, and he can be heard on a lot of early Son House recordings as Son House's accompanist on harp or on harmonica. And one other artist that I kind of want to mention here, it's actually a duo. And these guys were very influential in helping to influence the guitar and harmonica duos, the harp and guitar players, if you will. See what I did there? That came around in the 1930s. It was sort of the beginnings of the early forms of blues bands or ensembles being put together, where you started to see a lot more of, rather than having a single singer and guitar picker playing a set at a juke joint, now you would have these small combos or these small duos performing together and supporting one another. And a perfect example of that is Leroy Carr. Now, Leroy Carr and Scrapper Blackwell, Leroy on piano and Scrapper Blackwell on guitar, were an amazing duo, and they were very successful in the sense that they did a lot of professional performances and professional recordings, and toured a lot in some of the northern cities and northern states, but they still maintained that connection to their roots in the South. So they performed just as often in crummy juke joints in rural areas as they did in, fancy blues clubs in St. Louis or Chicago or Detroit. Now, the nice thing about Leroy Carr and Scrapper Blackwell is that not only did they perform a lot and record a lot, but a lot of their recordings became blues standards that are still played by, electric Chicago bluesmen today. Songs like How Long's This Evening Train Been Gone and things like that, right? Where, they were recorded in the 30s and they keep being re-recorded and revisited by modern bluesmen because these duos or these small ensembles really had a really excellent understanding of how they could take the blues from its sort of most simple form and really elevate it to the next level. Now, of course, a lot of the solo performers like Charley Patton and Son House really had this on lock already to begin with. But now we're starting to see through this time period, the mid to late 30s, these small groups or ensembles sort of joining together and touring together to support one another. Now, this is much different than these large string bands that we saw through the late 19-teens and early 20s, like the Mississippi Sheiks and the Memphis Jug Band and these guys. Now, these guys have a long history that go back to the medicine shows and a lot of these sort of tours that went on in the South through like I said, the teens and the 20s. But as we step into the 30s, you see not only these string bands and these ensembles forming, but as I mentioned, also these duos or these small trios starting to form as well. And that just helped to propel the music forward. And these musicians were able to explore and expand on a lot of the basic blues themes. And this is also the time period where I mentioned earlier that a lot of these blues artists now were starting to not only write their own material, but they were introducing themselves as the subject matter within their songs, or people that they knew. It was more of a personalized form of music at this point now. They weren't focusing so much anymore now on singing songs about people of myth and legend. This was rooted in a much more of a sense of reality now. And that, again, helped to not only personalize the music, but now each individual bluesman, as he was learning his craft, could develop his own style now, as opposed to just emulating older styles and singing about older figures of history. Now their content was more on a first-person level, and the listener really responded to this as well, because they were able to put themselves into the bluesman or the artist that they were listening to, put them into that person's shoes, and a lot of times they could relate to the subject matter, whatever the artist was singing about. So for me, the 1930s, although it's very tough to find a lot of really good quality recordings, especially for me as a collector, I like collecting these old 78 records. And the stuff from the 30s is, of any decent quality, is either much too rare or way too expensive for somebody like myself to get my hands on. So that's why it's great to find stuff like these, re-releases of some of the earlier recordings, on certain record labels, like a lot of the early Smithsonian recordings and Library of Congress recordings, Blues and Folkways label and that sort of thing, Document. These labels that were able to really dig and sift through a lot of this old stuff and remaster it and then repress it and re-release it. So to wind things down for today, I also want to mention, of course, as I often do, one of my favorites, Big Bill Broonzy. You can see right here, Big Bill did a lot of recording through the 30s and into the 40s. And Big Bill was one of these guys that was able to sort of cross all of the barriers within the blues. He could play out at a country juke joint and play, very early primitive styles of proto blues. And he was also, he could also play the modern, more up-to-date stuff, the stuff that people were requesting for him to play when he was playing at these juke joints. And he was also able to sort of transform himself and take his repertoire into more professional blues settings like auditoriums and theaters and coffee houses, slightly tweak his style to sort of that more polished professional. In fact, through the 40s, he actually recorded a lot of early jump blues and rhythm and blues as well. So he sort of passed himself off as this sharecropping farmer who would sit and pick his guitar on his front porch, but he was also able to market himself as a professional, polished entertainer, you know, suit and tie, playing at these fancy New York and Chicago clubs through the late 30s and early 40s. So these are just a few examples of some of these early bluesmen from the 30s as we move from that decade into the 40s that were not only influential on shaping what would become modern blues, but they were influential on the next generation or even the next two generations that followed them. And those men in their own right made their own mark on the blues and helped it to become what it is today. You know, you have guys like Charley Patton influencing the Howlin' Wolf, and you have guys like Son House influencing Muddy Waters. And then the Howlin' Wolf, you know, would go on to influence everyone from, you know, the Rolling Stones and Eric Clapton. And you had guys like Son House and Skip James influencing guys like Ry Cooder or Steve Vai. So, you know, it's amazing how the music from 7 or 8 decades earlier can still be relevant and pertinent to a blues artist of, you know, the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even up to today, for example. So I think that's going to do it today on Harp and Guitar for your blues history. And join me next time as we now step into the blues time machine here and move from the 30s finally into the 1940s, and we'll explore some of the pre-war stuff and then the post-war stuff, and examine the difference between these two time periods in this genre of blues music. So if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and share the video. Let us know what you think down in the comments below. And if you get a chance, head over to our homepage, Harp and Guitar, here on YouTube. And if you like what you see, subscribe. And if you have any suggestions or anything that you want either Monk Music or myself to cover, please don't hesitate to let us know. Leave us an email or a comment, and we'll try to cover it off as best we can for you, okay? So I think that's going to do it here for today at Harp and Guitar. I want to thank all of you for tuning in, and we'll talk to you again real soon. Have yourselves a great day. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye.